Alright, so this is a quick update on this bicycle here that I've been working on retrofitting into a motorcycle. I guess from the last video I made for this thing, it had still had the bicycle tires on it, but I guess I'll do a walk around from it, front to back. So, it has, on the front, it has a 21-inch CRF 450 front wheel, and the brake caliper that goes along with it, and that just goes right up to there. And then what I had to do to get this wheel to fit on the bicycle front fork is that I had to make a spacer shim for it that goes right here, and then there's another spacing shim that goes right there. And then instead of buying an axle specifically made for this wheel, I used a piece of 1/2-inch ready rod. Just goes all the way through, and it has a nut welded on this side of the rod, gets pushed in, and then a nut threads onto this side, and then this 1/2-inch ready rod doesn't fit tight inside the wheel hub, so I had to make spacers for it so it would fit tight, which was a bit of a process. And then another thing I had to do to get the front fork to fit over this wheel is that I had to cut the centerpiece here, make it wider by welding in an extra length, and then the fork clamps here, the ones that were on it were about this much too short, so I made fork clamp for the bottom and the top. It's all out of all the metal I used to build this thing was either L channel or 1/8-inch sheet metal. So there was a lot of welding I had to do to get all this put together. But yeah, I made the fork clamps for this thing. They're all made out of 1/8-inch sheet metal. Like each piece of the side was cut out, welded all together. Yeah, just bolts, clamps right there. Then there's a band that goes around, clamps that one, and same as this. Yeah, and then the pivot point for the rear suspension is right here, because this was a Super Cycle Hooligan bicycle, had a pivot point right there, so that's where the pivot point is for the rear suspension. And yeah, kind of see the engine is bolted up in all 4 spots. There's a bolt there, there's a bolt back there. You can kind of see the underside of this a little bit, hopefully. Yeah. And yeah, there's the pedal for the rear brake is right here. And there's the rear brake for a 250cc ATV. But to get this brake caliper to fit on this 19-inch rear, I had to space out the brake router with some washers and stuff. And then surprisingly, the only part of the drivetrain from the original bike is actually still there. It's a little shaft from the bicycle where the pedals go on to. I do weld a sprocket on it. That was from many months ago when I still had the bicycle wheels on it. But I welded a band of sheet metal to it and pressed in this high-speed bearing here. And then this piece here just keeps it centered. So that stabilizes the I guess it's called a jack shaft. Because the 200cc engine on this thing, it's really hard on the jack shafts for these bicycles. It'll just blow them up pretty quick. So, yeah. And then I changed the gear sizes on this piece here. So, yeah. So I guess the gear ratio on this thing, what is it? It's goes from a 10 to a 28, then a 17 to a 60. So it's like 8.5 or something like that, 9 to 1. Yeah. Had to make chain guides for it and stuff. There's a chain guide there. It's a fairly interesting thing, I guess. It's all kind of boxed in a little bit and whatever. And there's one up here. Another chain guide. And the muffler is as it is. And then the gas tank's just bolted together like that. And then the mount for the rear shock and the seat. It's well, the rear shocks here, there's a 3/8 bolt that's just pressed into the suspension arm there and then welded in. And that's what this shock bolts to. On the other shock there's a tab with a bolt that's welded to it, and that's how that one bolts in. And then the upper mount here, it's bolted in, and then it has a band there, so when the shocks push up, it doesn't slip. And then there's just a seat support. And then the shocks, they are staggered. So one side like that, and then the others like that. So it strengthens, or not strengthens, but makes the drive feel a little more stiff. Like it doesn't wobble as much when they're like that. And yeah, the PZ30 carburetor that I have on this thing, it's just bolted directly to the engine, so it's, you can see it's on sideways a little bit. So I had to adjust the height of the float in the float bowl. I had to adjust where it engages with the needle valve, because just bolting it up as it comes stock, it'll leak fuel. Because it's sideways, it'll leak out the overflow. So you have to adjust the float bowl engagement with the needle valve so it doesn't leak. Other than that, I guess you can see where it's at now. And starting the, this is the 208cc. It's listed as a 9.8 or so compression, 9.8 to 1 compression or something like that. So its owner manual recommends that it runs on 91 octane. But with the carburetors that come on these things, they're not very easy to start sometimes. But getting even like a PZ 24, 20, or 28 or whatever, getting one of these kinds of carburetors for one of these, it makes it a lot easier to start the thing because it has a better idle. It has 2 different jets in it. One's for an idle jet, and then the other's a main jet. So, and then the original carbonators that come on these things, they're tuned for 1 RPM. They're not really meant to idle really low. They're meant to run at 1 set RPM. So getting one of these for the thing makes it run better on and use less fuel. Yeah. And then you can see where that shock is mounted to. It's just tab of sheet metal that's welded to the frame with a bolt coming out of it. Yeah. Other than that, having these big of wheels on the front fork here that was originally made for a bicycle, it's pretty hard on the forks because this is a much larger wheel than it was designed for. So the little shims or whatever in the tube right here, they're kind of worn out. They have a fair bit of play in them now. So, but it works for getting around. Yeah, and then one other thing, the data sheet for the specs on this 208cc engine, it's listed for at 2400 RPM. It's rated for 30 foot-pounds. So it's a very high torque engine. So with this one, it makes what was it? Went up a really big hill one day with this thing, and I measured the speed I was going up that specific graded hill, and after doing some calculations and stuff with the PZ30 on it, with the muffler I made for this thing, it worked out to about 18 horsepower or so, and that's near 35 to 4,000 RPM, so 18 horsepower out of a setup like this. So, and yeah, that's about 35 miles an hour or something, going up a big hill. But the thing just has a centrifugal clutch on it, but it has it has 428 chain on it, which is rated for 5,800 pounds, and it's even on this spot right here, it's really taken a beating. It's stretched a lot, and then having the same 428 chain back here, but after this, this thing really needs this thing, like if one of these gets built the way this one is, the number 41 or number 40 or 35 chain, it's not gonna run the best with those. It'll work for just like going around really slow, but if you like open the throttle on one of these with the 35 or 40, 41 chain, it'll just snap those chains like instantly. So for long-term use, if I were to rebuild the drivetrain on this thing, I would build it with number 50 sprockets, and that way with a number 50 sprocket, if once those get broken in, you could theoretically put a number 520 O-ring chain on it, and then it would be good for a long time. But then those chains are very expensive. But yeah, the 208cc high compression little utility motor like that works really good for cruising around at 30 to 35 miles an hour. If you make the gear ratio taller, it'll cruise at a higher speed, but then it's not going to be able to make it up hills or anything. So it's the optimal gear ratio for one of these little 200cc engines. If you can gear it so the engine does 1,000 RPM for every 7 miles an hour, 1,000 RPM for every 7 miles an hour of speed, that's a pretty good gear ratio. You'd be able to get up most hills and stuff, and then still have a pretty good cruising speed for just going around town or whatever.